Wow.
Those
words.
are the rhetorics that the world is analyzing, because when a statement comes from the President of the United States, you know it is really strong and they have implications.
Absolutely. Well, before he made that speech, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres had just, warned the world that we should not sleepwalk into war. And then you now have Donald Trump coming right after that saying, look, if the need arises, we will actually destroy. Those are his words.
Those are strong words.
Destroy North Korea. Well, we have a guest joining us, from Abuja. He's a political risk analyst, researcher, Uche Igwe. Thank you so much for joining us via Skype this morning. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. How are you?
Yeah. Very well, thank you. What do you make of Trump's stance at the UN General Assembly, where he said that if the need arises, the United States is actually strong enough to destroy North Korea?
Well, I think that, like you said, those are very strong words, and Trump's speech is actually very disturbing. But beyond that, one will begin to think about the real implications of war, because Trump is doing the headline, and obviously the leader of North Korea is also doing a headline. So if there is no middle ground, obviously, the war path will be unavoidable. That is the way it's looking at the moment, especially because implicit in Trump's speech is that they're getting a lot of support from China, in their stance against North Korea. But then the implications of war in that region is something that I think is avoidable at this time. And, and my sense is that there's a need to begin to think about communication channels that can explore dialogue and middle ground, because the kind of threats coming from North Korea and the kind of accumulation of missiles and nuclear weapons is not something that spells good for the world.
At the 72nd UN General Assembly, Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari called for a compact delegation of the UN Security Council to visit North Korea and have a dialogue. How likely is that to happen?
Well, I think that I applaud the president for that kind of proposition. If the leader of North Korea accepts the Security Council to explore channels of dialogue, I think that would be very useful. Because the kind of stance that President Trump has at the moment, is not likely to be helpful, if you ask me. There has been very strong sanctions from the United Nations, as I'm sure you're aware, but it appears that, the North Korean leader is not ready to budge. So I think that, while if sanctions and threats have not worked, I think that the world should think about exploring communication channels and dialogue as proposed by President Buhari.
The Japanese Prime Minister has said that the days of dialoguing with North Korea are, long past. I wonder what kind of options really are left when you even have Kim Jong-un saying that Trump is only a barking dog.
Well, I think that, if you ask me, it's a carrot and stick approach. For someone like the North Korean leader who has accumulated, who has that level of strength and who has been boasting about what he can do and not do, it is important that the world remains vigilant, but at the same time, to begin to explore communication channels. I think ultimately what is important here is peace. What is important here is to make sure that the ballistic missiles that the North Korean leader is said to have accumulated, he's not allowed to test them. Whether he's defeated or not is another thing. But I think what is important is that the world should throw a preventive, rather than combative approach to the North Korean issue. I think that's what's critical for me, and that's what I think that should be explored. Will North Korea be defeated by the United States and her allies, that's a subject of another conversation altogether. But my sense is that at this point, getting, learning from the experience in Iraq, experience in Libya, I think that the world should begin to speak both to Trump and to the leader of North Korea to consider peaceful options rather than combative options at this time.
All right, the United States is expecting countries like China, that is the biggest ally of North Korea, to act and intervene, and possibly also Russia. But China, on the other hand, is standing aloof to say that the countries that are involved should handle their political issues and all of that. What role should China really play in reducing or dousing the tension around the Korean Peninsula?
Well, I think that part of the reasons why China is sitting on the fence is because of the hard line of the United States to the Korean issue. I suspect that China would have some contextual experience about what to do or what not to do to make sure that the matter is resolved. What is on the table here, if you ask me, ultimately, is not who is stronger, whether it's United States or North Korea. But what is important here is to explore options for peace. I suspect that one way to begin to cut China and get much more support from them is for President Trump to begin to step down on his current hardline approach.
But of course, the EU has agreed to place sanctions on North Korea. Sanctions have been in place in the past and they don't seem to have worked. What are the guarantees that sanctions this time around, where banks have been, banned from doing business with North Korea and all of that?
All importations,
and what have you. What are the guarantees that these sanctions will work?
Well, like I told you, for a country that threatens the world, for a country that is said to be accumulating this level of ballistic missiles, I think it's important that the world remains vigilant. And the sanctions imposed on them that continues to weaken their capacity, continues to reduce their supplies, reduce their funds, and sort of place those who are working with them allegedly under global watch is an important thing to do. Because if you look at the leader of North Korea, if you look at his pronouncements in the past 3-4 months, he's not somebody that you must not watch. I think it is important to watch him. I think it's important to impose sanctions on North Korea at this time. But again, like I said, a carrot and stick approach. While imposing those sanctions and not lifting them because of the possible consequences, I think it's also important to find ways to explore channels of communication through the allies of North Korea, for instance, so that a peaceful resolution can be achieved, so that this leader, can be persuaded, if you like, to reconsider, testing and, he should consider de-escalating, these accumulations so far that pose threat to the world. So I think, in my view, is a carrot and stick approach. Let the sanctions remain, and let the oil supplies be reduced, let the ban on gas continue, but yet let there be some conversation for, to explore peace, so that this leader can, reduce some of this attention is given to accumulation of weapons and ballistic missiles.
All right, certainly it's not news as to what power a country will have and the bragging rights if you have nuclear power and all of that. But in all of this, what does North Korea really aim to achieve at the end of the day? What does it really want?
Power, control, competition. It appears now that, if you listen to President Trump and the response from the North Korean leader, it appears that North Korean leader is willing to confront the United States. Of course, the United States is a global superpower. So either as a regional power or as a global power, I think what the leader of North Korea wants to do is to tell the United States and her allies that North Korea is an emerging sort of military, if you like, superpower. So for me, that is an important thing, to gain, in my view, for him.
But of course, North Korea is saying it's coming up with this nuclear deterrence to protect itself from U.S. aggression. And I wonder, people are just wondering, is it that the U.S. really wants to take North Korea out just for the sake of it? Now, some analysts, let me put this in. Let me just drop this. Okay, let me drop this. Let me drop this very quickly. Some analysts are already looking at this in dollars and cents, saying the U.S. at the end of the day, with the missile defense program, would be benefiting from this whole North Korea drama. They're already setting aside $700 billion for the
military.
Exactly.
Well, there is always a conflict economy, and there will be benefits. Of course, diplomacy is enlightened self-interest for nations, so you cannot rule that out at all. But what is important here is that these are two countries, who are sort of confronting one another. And if you really listen to President Trump, even though ultimately he said if the United States is left with no other choice, they would go to war. I think that there is something implicit in his statement that there are other choices. And what is important here is for concerned international devotees of peace to begin to pressure the United States to first explore other opportunities that are implicit in the pronouncements of the president before ultimately, looking at the war option. Another thing also is for the media, because I listened to the speech over and over again. I listened to the speech this morning. If you notice, even though ultimately President Trump talked about war, well, he said that if the United States is left with no other choice. So that means that there are other choices. And my sense is that those choices must be explored before, looking towards the direction of war.
All right.
Regardless of who benefits, really. Like I told you, when things like this happen, there are all kinds of permutations about who will benefit. But ultimately, the people of the world will lose. Countries around North Korea, people who are doing things in North Korea, around North Korea, allies of North Korea, are the people who will lose. I mean, if you look at, we must learn from history. By the time we started looking at Iraq and Libya, there was this tendency to oversimplify what it would look like. But lo and behold, this is where we are. Look at Afghanistan. So I think that, it is important for that framing, to explore peaceful approaches to the North Korea issue. Obviously, if you look at the kind of rhetoric coming from the North Korean leader, it's also very unhelpful, as it were. But what do we do? Two wrongs cannot make a right, as they say.
Yeah. All right. The world witnessed the First World War, which led to the formation of the League of Nations, and then collapsed with the Second World War that came in the mid of the 19th century, which led to the formation of the United Nations. Now, in this kind of rhetoric that is going on, the hard stance and all of that, what role should the United Nations be playing to ensure that there's no recurrence of events in the past?
I think there is no other global organization that has the responsibility to utilize this carrot and stick approach that I talked about than the United Nations. We all know that the Security Council has already imposed far-reaching sanctions on North Korea already. I read this morning that President Trump has signed an executive sanction allowing U.S. agencies to go after those who have links with North Korea. Granted, but I also think that the United Nations can also lead a more reconciliatory and a less adversarial approach, because we must all work together to prevent what you have alluded to, another world war. So no other organization has that responsibility to do that more than the United Nations. So it is my expectation, and I'm sure expectations of many people, that the United Nations, now that President Trump has stated the stance of the United States, that the United Nations should use her agencies to explore options for other forms of less confrontational and less adversarial options.
Yes, of course, North Korea's southern neighbor, South Korea, they are the ones actually at the receiving end of North Korea's naughtiness. And they themselves are saying, look, we don't want North Korea to actually be destabilized. Will reason prevail at the end of the day? When Elton John actually sang Rocket Man, I'm sure he didn't have in mind what Kim Jong-un is doing right now. But will reason prevail at the end of the day? What will it take for that to happen?
Well, I'm an optimist, so I think that ultimately reason will prevail. And I think that South Korea really will be one of the countries to begin to consider in terms of finding creative ways to reach out to North Korea. I suspect that Koreans are the same people. So whatever impacts on North Korea, regardless of their political differences, will impact on South Korea. So I think that that kind of, options of looking at the big picture is very helpful. Let's pause a moment to say, if this aggression between the United States and North Korea escalates, ultimately, who loses? The people. So yes, I think that could, assist us to begin to, like I said earlier, make a case, for a more peaceful approaches to resolving the Korean crisis.
All right. Uche Igwe, political risk analyst and researcher, thank you very much for talking to us on TVC Breakfast.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.